In this portion of our lecture, we're going to be continuing to look at writing narrative, and we're going to talk about a couple of things that can help you as you actually get into telling the story itself. So one of the things that we talk about a lot in creative writing is showing versus telling. And so this is going to be a really important distinction. So whenever possible, instead of just telling me what happened and saying this is what happened, or this is how you should feel, or this is what I want you to get out of this, instead of telling it to us directly, what's actually going to be better most of the time is to show us. So instead of telling us what we should do, invite us into the scene, invite us into what's happening. So some showing strategies that can really help you. So first of all, description is going to be your friend there. That doesn't mean just ladling on as many adjectives as you can come up with, but giving a really full-bodied description of the scene and what's unfolding is a great way to show me instead of tell me what you want me to be thinking. Figurative language, metaphor, and simile is also very powerful. So the type of associations, the type of comparisons that show up can be extremely powerful for the type of what I'm going to think. So what the audience is going to get out of it is going to be really connected to the figurative language, the metaphor, the simile. Consider, too, how other characters respond to the main character or the character you want to be talking about right then. That's a great way to show us, instead of having a narrator come in and tell us what to think, how the characters are acting, whether we're supposed to agree with them and get in line, or if we are to dissent and not take that side. That can be something that's a really great showing strategy. And another thing is to consider all of the ways that we say so much and communicate so much without words. If you've ever been in one of those texting conversations that miscommunicates a bit, one of the things that's the problem is that by text and by the written word, so much is lost. You don't get the tone, you don't get the look in the person's eyes. There's a lot that you just aren't going to get across in that, and that can be a big problem when communication happens, but it also shows us the way that showing can be so very powerful, and some of that non-verbal communication, which results hopefully in communication rather than non-communication, is a really important part of that. So I have an example for you of showing versus telling. In children's literature, it can be a little bit different. We actually do see a lot of telling in children's literature, and this is taken from C.S. Lewis's very famous and very beloved classic, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, one of his Chronicles of Narnia. If you're reading them in what I consider the right order, I know it's a heated issue. This is the first one. Otherwise, it can fall later in the schema. So here we see actually the first line in it is setting up what's happening, and the way that that's done is through telling us information. So instead of a conversation that happens between Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, where we have to figure out that there's a Peter, a Susan, an Edmund, and a Lucy, we are told once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. So that's not a bad sentence, it's not a problematic sentence, either of these, but it is something that's telling, and if the whole story through were telling like this, we likely wouldn't have the same thoughts about the story because we wouldn't be as engaged. This is giving us a lot of information, it's giving us that information quickly, and that's what telling does. But what showing does is it touches our emotions and it really invites us into this process. So later on page 151 in the text that I'm looking at, what we find is that the events have played out in many ways. Something that happened to them when they were away from London. They have found a fantasy world called Narnia that is through a wardrobe, and there is a representation of Christ there, and that is Aslan. He is a lion, and here he is sacrificing himself to save that 3rd child, to save Edmund. And so we have this moment of great sacrifice, and what happens here is some very intense showing instead of telling, and that allows us to connect. So I'll read a passage from here starting on 151. So we have Lucy and Susan, the 2 girls, held their breath waiting for Aslan's roar and his spring upon his enemies, but it never came. 4 hags grinning and leering, yet also at first hanging back and half afraid of what they had to do, had approached him. "Bind him, I say," repeated the White Witch. The hags made a dart at him and shrieked with triumph when they found that he made no resistance at all. Then others, evil dwarfs and apes, rushed in to help them, and between them they rolled the huge lion over onto his back and tied all four of his paws together, shouting and cheering as if they had done something brave, though, had the lion chosen, one of those paws could have been the death of them all. But he made no noise even when the enemies, straining and tugging, pulled the cord so tight that they cut into his flesh. Then they began to draw him toward the stone table. "Stop," said the witch. "Let him first be shaved." Another roar of mean laughter went up from his followers as an ogre with a pair of shears came forward and squatted down by Aslan's head. Snip, snip, snip went the shears, and masses of curling gold began to fall to the ground. Then the ogre stood back, and the children, watching from their hiding place, could see the face of Aslan, looking all small and different without its mane. The enemies also saw the difference. "Why, he's only a great cat after all," cried one. "Is that what we were afraid of?" said another, and they surged round Aslan, jeering at him, saying things like, "Puss, puss, poor pussy," and "How many mice have you caught today, cat?" and "Would you like a saucer of milk, pussums?" "Oh, how can they?" said Lucy, tears streaming down her cheeks. "The brutes! The brutes!" And it continues on from there, and what I really want to focus on in this is how instead of just giving us a line that tells us, "Then they humiliated him," which is what's happening. And we could have all of this summed up in that, or just, "And then they cut off and shaved his mane." That would be another way to say that. That would just be telling us, though. And what is happening here is we're shown what is happening. When we have snip, snip, snip went the shears and masses of curling gold. And notice even the phrasing there, that it's just really so visual, that falling to the ground of the hair. We get this kind of zoom in moment. If you think about it as almost having your own camera that you're telling the story with, that's what's happening when you're showing. And so it doesn't mean that you have to show absolutely everything. You can't tell us anything. You can tell us things, but showing is a great way to have a lot of really powerful images brought in and a lot of emotional connection as well. So making sure that for the important moments that you're showing us a lot is great, a fantastic idea. One of the ways that you can do this is to think about that difference between scene and summary. So scene is just what we read. That's when everything is playing out before you in real time. This slows down the narrative. So the moment that we just looked at with Aslan is when he is being brought to the stone table and he is going to be killed and sacrificed there. And we want that moment to be an intense one, and Lewis wants that moment to be an intense one because it is so important. So this gives a lot of depth. It slows down the narrative. It tells us that something is important. So choose scene for those important events, and that's going to emphasize them even more. Summary is when you're giving an overview of what has happened, and that speeds up the narrative. That's much more at the surface level. So that first example that we looked at, we don't have a scene of them leaving London. We don't have a scene of the air raids, and that de-emphasizes the air raids. It de-emphasizes what's happening with the World War II context, even though it still brings it in. So it's used for less important events or events that you want to seem less important in the overall schema. The last thing I want to touch on here is the importance of point of view. So choosing who is telling the story is a really big decision, so you want to think about that. If you have a first-person narrative, that's going to allow us to really closely connect to that narrator who's telling us the story. We are seeing from their point of view. You can also choose a third-person narrative. So that's going to be either omniscient or maybe a limited omniscience. So we're going to have to think about how much information that narrator has and how much that information is given to the reader. And one thing that you can think of with that is focalizing. So if you are using a third-person narrator, oftentimes it's still going to be inflected through one of the character's perspectives. So we're oftentimes going to stick really close to a character's perspective. So for instance, if you're familiar with and love the Harry Potter series, the Harry Potter series is a third-person narrator. We don't get it in first person, but we really are following Harry, and we're typically only going to have access to Harry's thoughts. We're not going to have access to everyone else's thoughts most of the time. And then occasionally we do actually get scenes where we might have other narrators who are what's called that vocalizing person. But that's something that can be helpful to you as well as you're moving through this.